To pick up things where we left off, may I take you back for one moment to the first paragraph on the excerpt from Proslogion that I provided. Therefore, O Lord, you who give understanding to faith, grant me to understand. Lurking behind that statement is a fairly famous medieval observation about the relationship between faith and knowing. So the term shows up prominently with Anselm and prominently with Augustine. They both use slightly different Latin, but it's the same vocables. Credo ut intelligam. Credo ut intelligam. So most of that, I generally reminded my undergrads, don't you guys dare zone out here, wait for me to give you what this means. A credo is very discernible. That's the I believe. And then I grant that we should supply the recognition that the ut is a purpose clause. It's signaling a purpose clause. I believe for the purpose of intelligam, intellectual appropriation, right? So I believe for the purpose of going on to understand. Now, an interesting thing, probably beyond our discussions this week, an interesting thing is that is the order of learning. So first comes belief,
Yes.
and then comes the understanding. This is not true only biblically and in matters of God and faith. This is also true scientifically. A scientist does not do his work based on a mountain of data that spontaneously combusts into a hypothesis. The scientist does his work on the basis of faith in a hypothesis, which he then tests out according to scientific method, the inductive method, perhaps you could say, right? An interesting thing is that this just does not seem to get into most logic classes or discussions about the different types of thinking we've been created to do. But there is deductive reasoning, which is reasoning to necessity. That's the sort of thing you felt in that syllogism I used yesterday. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. And you almost want to say, well, it's necessary then to agree Socrates is mortal. There's then inductive reasoning, which is reasoning to the highest degree of probability. But and it's usually assumed that's scientific reasoning. But actually, as we learned from Charles Peirce, which is one of the few things that's worthwhile in Charles Peirce, from the early 20th century, there's also abductive reasoning. That's the generation of hypotheses, do you see? And in Latin, that's the credo. So the credo is certainly apropos for we believe what God is telling us here in the scriptures. And then he does want us to go on to test this out inductively, not according to the narrow scientific method, but to test it out in real life. Mm. Isn't this also, by the way, what the Psalms tutor us in? Right? To come to God with those questions. So this is the pattern of learning overall. And the medievals are extremely honest and far-reaching in the way they're doing this. So this is before the scientific revolution and all that. Science has been done since Aristotle, but it's before the scientific revolution. And I think this is also another point of contact with our friends or family members or coworkers who are very skeptical about God and Scripture, and they think they have a better knowledge, but actually it's all the same process. And the question is what you have available for the sources of knowledge and understanding and wisdom. Yeah. This also has to do exactly with that quote that I've been harping on from Kurt Marquardt. So the problem with hermeneutics at St. Louis, which we didn't deal with thoroughly enough, that problem is that it was doing things scientifically rather than biblically or honestly even. So that's why Marquardt said, science has no room for privileged authority or sacrosanct texts. But of course, the scientist needs the sacrosanct text to appreciate what she's doing and why. However, the mechanism, the process is the same. The epistemological business, the knowledge business is the same. All right, so what did I give you a chance to get seated and recapture some of the thoughts you wanted to talk through about Anselm? All right, then I'm going to.
Sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you.
So I was having trouble making the connection that he seems to be trying to make in the last paragraph.
Yes.
Because it seems to me that it's very clear he gets as far as distinguishing between essence and existence. But I can't quite follow the leap from, because we can conceive of something that there's nothing greater than,
Yes.
that there actually is such a thing.
Right. Thanks so much. So I'm going to introduce a component of this that we haven't really talked about yet as a way of getting to respond to your question. So do you remember when I talked about the rapid communication that I learned about when I was visiting? Yeah, so the monks get around pretty quickly. Now, another part of proslogion is not just Anselm setting out his argument, but it is also the objections to what he is arguing. So a monk, I think it was a French monk by the name of Galmio, argued this way. He said, the problem with Anselm's argument goes something like this. Just because you can think of God, God necessarily exists, but Galmio said, I can think of a magical golden island or a golden mountain, and that doesn't make it exist. And what we find is that Anselm replies to him basically by saying, well, you weren't paying attention. And first of all, I am intrigued and kind of fortified by this back and forth where Anselm would take somebody's objection seriously and respond in writing so that everybody can think this through. Now, we do know that the medieval period, ended, this marriage ended because all of the monks shot each other in the foot. It was the interdenominational wars and actually battling over body parts of their favorite saints, right, that just destroyed the medieval period, and then that's that. But here we've got this great example of this interchange. So let me try to use that as a case in point. So the response that Anselm gives to this, okay, so you can understand God in your mind as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And Brother Anselm is saying, and that means that he necessarily does exist. But now I can think in my mind about this magic island or this golden mountain, but I notice that doesn't make those exist. Part of an important part of Anselm's response is Anselm is saying, well, we're talking about God, though. In my definition, and the whole discussion is about God. God is sui generis. So God is unique. He's one of a kind. And if anybody has taught that in a single comment on God, it's certainly Anselm. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, maybe here too, it will help to look at his notion of conceived and ask the question, I'll put it this way, where is that conception located? Okay, so we are folks who have been heavily psychologized in the way we think about things. I think that some of my psychological acquaintances might say, Schulz, when you talk about this, you're always talking about pop psychology. It's not my particular area of psychology. I would accept that, but I'm going to say we've been heavily psychologized in this way to think that the important stuff that's happening is happening in our heads. May I notice that actually is Descartes' shtick that's coming up in a little bit. Also, it's not right. So the big stuff that's happening does involve our heads and hearts, to be sure, but it has to do with language, which is the public domain.
Interpersonal.
That's right, intra and not inter. That's exactly right. So there is this reality that Plato had to depend on, even while he was saying that the reason we know something is good is because not of anything down here, but because of this idea of the good. It's something that Aristotle had to depend on, and he acknowledged it. It's something that Descartes had to depend on, and he hated it, and that is language, right? So language is the deal here. In the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant convinced folks in his day, and apparently most of us today also, that things are basically sort of Platonic. What counts is how you're thinking, and that individual rationality. Though to be fair, Kant said all human beings have this capacity, so it wasn't just me or something. But this is what's going on. So the fact of the matter is that the action is happening in language. Now, I get to work at this with you a little bit more, especially when we get to a little metaphor from Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's a 20th century philosopher that we need to pay attention to. But I'm going to say this now, and I'll be happy to repeat it then. Language is misunderstood if you think it's a tool for human beings. Language is misunderstood if we think that it's the outgrowth of our mental processes. Most every way that we've been taught to think about language is mistaken or sadly deficient. Language is the means by which we are human beings. Language is the means by which God communes with us. Language is the means by which we have fellowship with one another. As we've done in worship already too, possibly you were doing this in your prayers as well this morning. When we talk about the fellowship of the Holy Spirit, don't forget that this is all linguistically mediated.
Language should say that the everything that exists because of language.
Boom.
The word.
Right. That's right. God brought everything into existence, and let's again give thanks to him for the thoroughness of Luther's catechism explanations. He made me and still preserves me through his word. Yeah. Okay. So this is a total game changer for philosophical thought, especially in modernity. But it's also the case that there are a couple modern philosophers who caught this and provide resources, or I'm going to call it impetus, for people like you and me to dig deeper into scriptures and realize what's going on, contrary to what we've been taught or assumed in pop psychology and so forth. Right. So then the deal is that it is not a private conception. Okay, it's not a private conception. This was the big mistake of modernity overall. So somewhere I've got a couple little cartoon things I did of this. I'm terrible in drawing, so it's little stick people, you know. But so if you do a diagram of how things work for modern thinkers, such as Descartes, we mentioned Bacon the other day, modern thinkers, what you could do is you do a stick figure for the human being in their view, and that stick figure would have a real big head. That's the best I can do anyhow. You'd have a real big head, and the idea would be located in that big head. So what happens is you use that idea to figure out what something that you're perceiving is. That's a rational look at it. The empiricists do the same thing, locating the idea in the head, but they say the idea gets in there from sensory impressions. But the failure is to say the idea and the concept is fundamentally in my head. It's not. It's fundamentally in the atmosphere of language. So language is not a tool. Language is the atmosphere in which, and I'm deliberately paraphrasing Paul here, it's the atmosphere in which we live and move and have our human being. Okay?
That sounds Gnostic.
Why in the world would that sound Gnostic?
Well, because the language seems, unless you're talking about the divine word.
That's only Gnostic if you divorce language from
God.
physicality and reality. And it can't. It all has to go together.
Think about
How are you going to think about that?
But you can't think about it without talking about it.
I don't know. That's the thing, is I can't put words to it. It sounds like it's ethereal. It sounds like it's floating in space. It sounds like it's not concrete.
Maybe it's just because you're Gnostic.
Don't listen to him. He just had that.
Okay, now we've got some other hands coming up, but I don't mean to be cute about this. I mean to be tutorial about this.
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to assess that? How are you going to do your thinking? And the answer is in language. In language. The mistake is that what I call the psychological preconditioning
Right.
conditions us to think that something else is more basic than language. Everybody in modern philosophy, maybe kind of in philosophy generally, has been looking for what is the most basic thing that we have to get to understand reality and especially understand the human being. Yes? And there is nothing more basic than the logos, and the logos is language. There's no place you can stand outside language. There's nothing you can dig up that comes before language. Language was there before we human beings were created, as you know, in the creative word of God and in the person of the second person of the Trinity. Okay? So language is, if you like this terminology, language is properly basic. Language is the ultimate warrant. Language is something you can't get beyond. And you can prove this. You can prove this. Because everything that we're talking about doing, even thinking, and I would even grant, so you're going to want to think about this before you say something more about it. That's being done in language. It's being done because you were raised and taught inhaled and exhaled language according to God's continuing creative will.
And was the attack on that, the twisting of that, which was the first attack on God by Satan.
No, this is true.
And it's why we see the twisting of language and the twisting of, because if you can twist the spoken word, if you can twist the meaning of the written word, you twist the thought.
Yes, thank you. So the deception has to be done in language also. So Satan couldn't escape language. I do think, and you can feel free to think that I'm wrong on this particular point, but I do think that Satan's attack on language in the Garden of Eden was only World War I. And we're now in World War III. And after the Reformation, surely there was some sort of satanic committee meeting, right? So what are we going to do now? And the answer is we're going to take away people's confidence in language. We're going to sell them on a destructive, dismissive philosophy of language because the word we still have to let remain, right? We're not thankful for it. And this is what we're getting today. So it's not quite as, and I hope this doesn't sound bad, it's not quite as simple or easy to identify as what Satan was doing to our greatest grandparents. It's another version of that same attack. And that too is instructive about the utter importance of language for the gospel and for human beings.
It's the big tent pole.
Yeah.
And if you can kick at that and weaken at that, then you can, at least it makes it easier to get rid of every authoritative pillar and institution that is out there.
Yes.
The family, the church, authority in general. God is a God of order. And this just introduces chaos and
That's right.
the opposite.
Yeah. So it's an attack on language, but again, to reiterate, language is undeletable.
Right.
God has seen to that. So the only thing that Satan can do and his acolytes can do is they can interfere with our attention to language.
Especially twisted.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But
Are you thinking out loud again?
yes, language can be false. So it's not just so Satan first says, did God really say? So this is getting into the idea or the language of God to Adam, as Adam has then preached it to Eve. But then he says to Eve, did God really say? But he doesn't he doesn't stay there very long. He said, no, what's really true is that when you eat of it, you're going to be like God. So he tells a direct, he goes from engaging in the word to denying the word with the word, with words.
Why?
Let's
There's a lot true on that.
Oh, wait.
That was the part.
What I need to say here, to keep responding in what I believe is the helpful way is language is not false. It was a false use of language.
Yeah.
False use of language.
Yeah.
But you said language. Well, I mean, that sounds like language is a tool.
Well, Satan was using it as a tool. We'll grant that. But language is not a tool. Language is a divine gift of God. It is external to us in the first place. It is extra nos.
Doesn't the abuse of something prove its existence?
Yeah, we've got to get beyond the front pews here for a second. So
Sorry.
please.
I was just wondering, this, what is God putting at Babel?
Yeah.
We see Satan misusing language, and we see God confusing language to hinder communion, improper communion, which is resulting in rebellion against God. But is there something more beyond that? Or am I missing that?
Well, of course, it's a very profound thing, and it's a great example and reality to bring up. So, I think you just about answered your own question when you were asking that. It was God disrupting the disruption of fellowship with Him. So, remember that logos, as even the pagan Aristotle called, logos is the basis for fellowship on the horizontal. This is, I think, kind of indisputable. But it's also, as we know from Scripture, from Revelation, it's also the basis of fellowship from God to us and us to God. So that was the fellowship that those descendants, were doing there at the Tower of Babel. And God graciously stepped in. It's kind of like He stepped in for Cain, just like He steps in for us, right? Sin is at the door, and He made it very, very difficult to continue their abuse of fellowship. So we really should have a Sunday in the church here where we thank God for the Tower of Babel. There's a lot of mercy in that story. Also, I guess we're going to say it too, also an indication of the ultra importance of language. I think even hearing the story of Daniel this morning, think about what the Babylonians were in the custom of doing, giving people new Babylonian names. You can see the unavoidability and the power of language, even when it's being used or misused. But you can't get away from the language. Kyle?
I'm thinking of, I'm trying to synthesize these concepts. I think it was Augustine, I forgot which book, he was talking about how one knows that something beyond themselves exists, and you used love as being that connection of knowing how something exists outside of yourself. Kind of hearing Descartes, but in an inverse of it. And that how language, I don't know how to word it, but maybe it's the creation of love, and it creates an interaction of actually knowing what's out there. They're essentially like almost how light is both a particle and a wave, that the two can be separated, but must by nature work together.
Okay.
I don't know if that's true, but I think there's something because we're talking about how language can show the existence of God. And that love can also show, if Augustine's correct, the existence of everything around you outside of yourself.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to comment very briefly on it. It's a fascinating question, of course, but briefly to keep us still a little bit closer to the argument of God kind of question. But I think it's very valuable. So Augustine, among many other things, is known as the person who taught rightly ordered love. So this is a hugely important topic. And I think that you should probably fault any of us who do philosophical writing and teaching if we don't address the human emotions, and especially the emotion of love, because that's some sort of pre-censoring of a central reality for the human being, not to mention God, who so loved us. It's fundamental. Now, the thing that Augustine did then was he did this using his Platonic sensibilities, which is kind of interesting. So the way he says you should love God first, then you should love your neighbor, then you should love yourself. When you watch his explanation, he does say because God is the more worthy object of love, as in longer lasting, which sounds for just a second like that idea of the good outside Plato's cave. It's the better kind of thing because it's the eternal one. Yeah. So that's going on in there. And his attention to love is very important. But here's my brief answer to that. And that is, biblically speaking, we don't know what love is, certainly, if we don't have language, especially Bible language. So if you look at the Song of Solomon, right? My current friend, but former colleague at Concordia, Brian German, who's a Hebrew guy, he did a couple wonderful papers on how, in effect, he was saying, you won't know that you love your spouse or your spouse loves you if you don't talk. And his example is to look at the Song of Solomon. What is love? And Brian's a very circumspect guy and careful in a way that I'm not. So I would just say, so how do you know that two people love each other? And apparently to go by Hollywood and our TV screen as if you fall into bed together, right? But that does not do it. You have to have the language of the Song of Songs to talk about who the beloved is and what this means. So that is necessarily language-based also. And that's what I'd offer here. But a huge topic. I really agree. All right, so we have heard most recently about Gamio, the fellow who raises the objection. And I'm not sure that I've satisfied you on why the definition of God necessarily leads to his reality, right? So this does depend on language and how it works on us. So if you say that God is that than which something greater cannot be thought, you could use some synonyms there. Cannot be conceived, cannot be imagined, but I think you want to take a broad one, cannot be understood. So God is that than which nothing greater can be understood. Now, it's interesting and helpful and to the point to say when you're thinking that way, when you say, I understand that, you do seem to be committed to the top of the list stuff, and you're going to have to agree then that by definition, God must exist. I'm inclined to take a lesser point out of here that you already heard me articulate and say this is certainly the case, and that is that this immensely clear intellectual work that Anselm is doing for his cathedral, that this is clear evidence that believing in the God of the Bible is not an uneducated commitment. It's not silly, it's not illogical, it's not irrational. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's extremely sober and genuine, right? I think that's certainly a value of this. But I also think we have to consider what is it then that keeps us from getting it, that having this definition won't get us to acknowledging that God must really exist. And I think it must be our anemic understanding of language. So just for a quick, for instance, in there, are you folks familiar with the Barclay Daily Study Bible at all? This is one of those things where the volumes, at least in Hart, are very small little volumes. Barclay was is it British or Irish? Well, he was a kind of a beloved pastor over in Great Britain, I think. And a while ago, he wrote these extensive meditations, passage by passage, all the way from Matthew to the end of Revelation. And it seems that Barclay had, as best I can figure out, he had a photographic memory. So when he was talking about an issue, he could bring in all sorts of quotes, many of which I would never have known. But he brings them in. I think they're interesting expositions of what he's talking about. So when he's writing about John chapter 1, and Christ is the Logos, and then this leads into the matter of the importance and also the power of words and language. He brings up this story that he had read somewhere that took place when a group of Christians traveling in a Muslim country were met by this Muslim who said, "Peace be with you." And as he found out that these people were Christians, he wanted his words back. Because in his view, he was actually granting the peace of God to an infidel, which was a hard thing to do. So he wanted his words back. Now, we do not have that kind of treasuring and recognition of the value, the inherent meaningfulness, the power of words. That's part of the problem when we come to Anselm. But that's another reason to use Anselm, to investigate why is it that this worked so well for a medieval thinker and for the other monks, right? And we don't get it today. So in words I've used before, why is this not self-evident to us? And a thing can be self-evident, remember, in one of two ways, either in itself and to us,
Yes.
or in itself and not to us. Why is it not self-evident to us? And I then would use Anselm as a diagnostic source. So the problem is not his argument. The problem is our inability to see why this works. I mean, you notice the touch points, right? So the starting point, yeah, well, that's Psalm 14:1. Got to go with that. Then a fool, yeah. It's the Hebrew word there, right? Got to go with that. But then when you get down into the weeds, sort of, putting this definition to work and its necessity, that's where we kind of lose track. And I think it's because of our anemic view of language. Which means it's hard. We've got to do a lot of work here before we can see Anselm the way he would have been understood by people that read him initially. And it's worth the effort. So anything else on Anselm before we consider moving on?
Well, just kind of summarizing.
Yeah.
In the end, when he's saying, so if there's something, therefore, if that than which a greater cannot be thought were only in the understanding, then that which a greater cannot be thought would be that than which a greater can be thought. And so it's a contradiction.
Yes.
And in order to remove the contradiction, you have to grant that there is something which a greater cannot be thought.
Yes.
So it's really a logical argument. And it doesn't say what this greater is. It's just that there is something.
Very helpful, thanks. So the arguments for God's existence are, or the arguments for the existence of God would be the better way to say it, right? They are open to discussion, and they are very logical. That's part of the architecture, the pillars, so to speak, and the formation of the roof over the cathedral. It is logic. But what I'm also saying is that Anselm is operating with a logic that is very aware of the logos. So it's not just logic as if you could somehow put our ideas of logic ahead of language. It's rather that this is a kind of distillation from language or logic, which is insufficient or should be sufficient, and we don't get it today. So the notion here of understanding, what are you saying when you say I understand what you're talking about there? You're saying I know that, right? You're saying I get that. I accept that. You're saying credo. I believe it, right? So what Anselm is doing then is he's saying, well, as we all know, this is what that means, and this is what that means. And just to remind my friend Gaunio, we're not talking about imaginary islands and mountains. We're talking about the real God, based on Psalm 14, verse 1. And it's a whole different category, or rather, it's super categorial. You see?
Mm-hmm.
So when you agree to this, that's like that Arab person saying, peace of God be upon you. This is a real thing. This is not just some performance. Yeah, it's a real thing. And he wants his words back. So he wants the power of this, the reality of it. And so I suppose what we moderns are generally saying is we don't want to grant everything that we apparently really granted by saying we understand this. Which is also to say we're not using language to its fullest in there. We're not agreeing with everything the language is saying, even though we insisted we were. So there's that. You see? Yeah. It's also the case that Anselm's main goal here is not just to talk about the existence of the God of the Bible, but that is what he's talking about. His goal here is to do this as part of a larger project, of course. He's a churchman after all, and he's a preacher of the gospel after all. So he is I suppose, setting up a certain respectability for belief in God that will help bring people to church. But he's not saying I'm teaching about salvation any more than Psalm 14, verse 1 is teaching the plan of salvation. In fact, most of the psalm is law, isn't it? Yeah. So. It would be more helpful if we can come up with another question or two, because I'm breaking at 12:30, so I can start our next thing. But please.
I think it's just great talking about it, cheapening the word of, but it's not just in the brain, it's what I'm doing, we're doing right now. My question is, the advent of smartphones, computers and all that, I remember when I came across that phrase for the first time, word process. That sounds horrible. To process words. How much of that, computers and all that, are cheap? The very thing that should not be cheap.
Yeah, so we're going to regard this as a sidebar that does relate to this, but it's taking us into a bigger territory. Okay. Right. So I think my most efficient way of responding to that, and then we should ask how you feel about my response to this, is to talk for a second about technology. So the writing that I've got in mind is from the 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger has a writing called The Question of Technology. I will give you some clickbait. I hope I'm using that term right. That's something that's going to make you want to check this out and get there, right? By saying that it's fascinating to me that one of the examples he uses is the Lord's Supper, very briefly. I'm not going to explain that at all now. You have to look up Heidegger on Question of Technology. But so I'm going to clear the decks this way. It is very strange that we use the word technology for things like word processors, because they are tech, which would be, we saw that in one of our references here to Plato. They are tech in the sense that they are man-made things. They're artistry. They're not bits of nature. Okay. So what's odd is that we would tap the word logi on the end of that, as if we understood this and had made a big study of it, and it had been going on for generations, and we decided to do things this way because it's the best for humanity. It's far from it. I've actually been in ministry and also been in Lutheran higher education long enough to remember when the internet was being introduced. So I was at Wisconsin Lutheran College in Milwaukee at the time, and Gary Greenfield, the first acting president there, just said one day, he said, we've got to light the fiber. I didn't know what that meant. So I just listened and we've got to get going with computer networks and get on the internet because all of the other schools are doing. And so he was using the word technology, and I was kind of new to the faculty then, but my question was, why are we doing this? And I had the trust that it is something we should look at, but nobody could explain to me why we should do it except everybody else is doing it, right? So how does, for instance, word processing, how does this affect the teaching and learning process? First of all, it does affect it profoundly. So for good or for ill, what's going on there? I would say I've talked to editor friends over the years who say that word processing, we don't often use that term anymore, but word processing essentially has destroyed the book publishing business. And they said from their standpoint, we get hundreds of more material and books and they're 100 times worse than anything we used to get. Because people are just cranking this stuff out.
Yeah, it also teaches people how not to spell.
This is true too. Yeah. So before we get into our justified complaints about the details, the big thing is that I would also say word processing has actually helped me and also hurt me, but it's helped me because I am somebody who I don't know. I put no stock in the personality assessments at all, but I do know that I'm what some people might call something of a double or triple A, and I really find it hard to start writing. I also recognize the first sentence, sometimes the first word I use is the destiny for the whole paper. So I had a hard time with that, and word processing really helped me with that. So I could just get this going, and then if I had the discipline, delete it later on and pick up. Okay, but for the most part, it's not just spelling; it's also grammar, but it's thought. So when I was in seminary, last millennium, when I was in seminary, we had to do our papers on a typewriter. I thought it was all the rage that my parents had given me a IBM Selectrix to type on. This thing had changeable fonts on it. It'll have a little ball you could take off, put back on, and it had a correction feature. By pushing one button, the white tape would actually type back 3 or 4 letters, correcting. However, my professors insisted something like this. When I'm reading your papers, when I come to the 3rd typing mistake, I'm going to stop reading and grade the paper. So the fact that we had to type, or more accurately, my blessed new wife was willing to type for me, that really affected my discipline in writing. Okay, so the thing though is technology. So then the question is, in regard to language, what has let's call it the technological mindset does? It is first of all treating language as tech, something that's useful. You may even have memorized kind of one of the current understandings of the human being as homo faber, the maker of things. And we make stuff like language. That's why I've been grousing about that so much. So that would imply what Heidegger actually brings out. Heidegger says technology, and he means tech, but he also means the way we use tech. Technology enframes us. Doesn't that sound like a nice pregnant sentence? You want to know what that means, and maybe you want to use it. Technology enframes us. And he does mean that technology does show what we are capable of doing for good or for ill. And at the same time, when we do these tech projects, it changes our view of us as human beings. So certainly the big confusion at this exact moment is with something that's being called artificial intelligence. It is certainly artificial, but ladies and gentlemen, it is not intelligence. why that's going on. I've talked with sessions where we had, computer guys in there. They teach computer science and stuff. And they say, oh, yeah. And I say, well, why didn't you think of this? Right? Why are we calling this intelligence? So anyhow, that's the first act of the mind thing. So then what we've got is the reframing of us as the logos beings based on our assumption that language is something we can manipulate because it's our tool.
Yeah.
So that's what's going on in there. And it's being done without any logos. I mean that in a couple senses, but it's being done without careful study. We're just doing it because we can do it. And isn't that the bane of modern science? Why are you doing that? Because we can. If we don't do it first, someone else will. Including altering the human being. This is, however, a more profoundly affecting of human beings, this dallying around with our view of language, than any of the artificial, and by the way, sometimes helpful brain implants to help people with limb loss and to navigate some of that stuff. This notion of techizing language is profoundly harmful. So, I don't say word processing is evil, but I won't agree it's a good thing, per se, good thing either. Thanks. We can fit in one more comment or question if you'd like to. I found myself, I often had to say to classes just before lunch, and I'm not letting you go early anyhow, so you might as well ask something. I will have to let you go because we have to be here. But was there anything else you wanted to get out briefly? Are tired. Okay. Amen.